Hey guys, what is up? And today I'm going to show you how to create a star field. In the first step, we're going to create a star using a technique which is called a signed distance function. If you want to learn more about this specifically, you can go to a website I've linked down in the description. The artist I'm linking there is called, I think he's called Inigo Quilez. I hope I'm not butchering his name, but he's a genius. He's actually pretty insane, and most of the stuff I learned through him, or the first steps of it I learned through him. And his website is really helpful, and I definitely recommend you checking it out. So what we are starting with here is basically just a plane, and we're going into top view mode. And just to be sure, this is not a beginner Blender tutorial. You should be somewhat familiar with the node interface and also Blender in general. So let's get started. The first thing that I have to say is I've got a special node here, which is first showing me the coordinates, and then I have a second node which is visualizing the signed distance function. And this is going to come in handy in a few seconds when you're going to actually work with signed distance functions. Let's talk about what actually is a signed distance function. In the simplest case, we can just take a vector math node, set it to length, take another math node, set it to subtract, plug it into the signed distance function here, and if we set the split, you can see that we have a circle here. And what this thing is actually showing us is if we have a brown, then it's the inside of an object. The white line is where the value is 0. The blue outside is a positive value. And the idea of a signed distance function is that you have an object, and for each coordinate x and y, you can exactly tell how far you are from the object. For a circle, it's pretty easy. You just take the length of the vector and subtract the radius of the circle. And it gets more complex, the more complex the object gets. And there are signed distance functions for all kinds of stuff, and Inigo Quilez has a lot of them on his website. For example, for simple things like rectangles, triangles, etc. And it's pretty cool because it is really powerful and you can do a lot of things procedurally just in shaders. So let's get started on the actual star. The reason why I have this split function here is because as we manipulate the actual coordinate space, so if we add a vector math as an add, plug this in here, and as we move our coordinates, you can see that as our circle moves, also the coordinate space is moving, or basically when we move the coordinate space, our circle is moving accordingly. And we will abuse this later, but for now we can just keep it at 0, 0 and just have the coordinates be normal. First thing, we're going to delete our circle because we actually don't want to make a circle. And first thing for the star is we want to have symmetry. And for that, just take a vector math node, set it to absolute, plug it in. And now you can see here in the vector space, you can see how our thing has changed. We don't have these different things, but we only have this space, which is purely positive in x and y, and we've mirrored it to all sides. So that way we can just work on the positive axis here and don't have to worry about anything else. We want to have two values. And the first will be what I call the cutoff, and the second one is the size. They all have kind of similar things, and I don't know what to call them better, but I just call the first one, I call it cutoff, and I call the second one the value. And the cutoff, what it will do is we're going to have a hyperbolic function which is going to be kind of here, and the cutoff will transform this thing diagonally. And to do that, we're going to take a combine xyz, plug it into x and y, and that way, if we just take a vector add, you can see that this is a diagonal transform because we're adding the same vector in both directions. So we have a perfectly diagonal transform. We're going to plug that in here. We're going to add those two together so we can later cut it off there. So as you can see here, it's kind of looking a little bit weird, but you can still see that it's moving diagonally. And that is because, remember, we mirrored it at the x and y axis. So we're actually only controlling this quadrant and the rest is just mirrored. After that, we're going to take a separate xyz, and out of that, we're going to do a hyperbolic sign on both the x and y axis and multiply those two together. This is going to take just a math node, select hyperbolic sign, and this is not going to show anything here because this is just in the x-axis. To actually get those two, we have to, if you plug in this here, you can see this is on the y-axis, the same thing. But if we now take another math node, set it to multiply, plug that in here, you can see that we almost have our star. And one thing to keep in mind is that usually with sine distance functions, you try to keep the actual distance the same, because there are a lot of functions you can apply on the sine distance, because it's really easy to do outlines, because you can just take the values between, for example, negative 0.1 and 0.1 to have the outline. But because this function is not exact, you have this distorted kind of distance field, and you can see that really well with the lines. You can see that they're getting bigger here. This is just because the sine distance field is actually not a good sine distance field, but it's a distorted one. But for our cases, because we're just going to fill it out, it's actually fine. So the final thing that we're going to do is we're going to subtract a value from it. This is just the value we're taking from the beginning. Then you can start playing with the values. And as you can see, we kind of have to use very small values. So it might be reasonable to have a divide, for example, divide by 100. And just a little tip, if you hold shift while you slide those values, you can get a little more fine-grained control. But as you can see, we already have this kind of star shape that we want. If you wanted to have the star kind of extended in the y-axis, we could just distort the sine distance field. Because we've already messed up the sine distance field, there's no real reason to use another thing to retain it. So we can just scale the y-axis. So we would just take, if you just take a math node to evaluate this, you set it to greater than this, and take a mix RGB, plug it in here, plug the sine distance function in, set it to greater than 0, set the color to anything that you want, plug it in. And now, as you can see, the thing that we had before was kind of misleading. You kind of extend those values. Now you can see we actually have a star here. That's how you create the base star. To kind of make it a little bit easier, we're all gonna just put this in one node. I always just name it Hyperbolic Star. And now we have a much easier overview and much easier control. As you can see, you can really get those nice flares with these long edges. Looks really nice. Now let's go into the next part, which is distributing the star. This is the next challenge, because what you could do first, of course, is just duplicate this and shift it around, which would certainly work, but it will also increase the amount of computational power that you need. But there's actually a really cheap way to distribute the star around. And it all has to do with Voronoi texture, which is actually pretty great. And I'm gonna disconnect the Hyperbolic Star for now. I'm just gonna use our circle node. You can also group this together. So I'm gonna plug it in here. You can see we got our circle. And now we're gonna take a Voronoi texture, which is really great for procedurally distributing anything that is like kind of randomly distributed. That's what's really great for. If you plug in the position in the vector here, as you can see, this is not a good thing where you could plug this in directly. This is unfortunately not the case. But because it just says you where the middle is, what we can actually do is we take the position vector, which mind you is just that thing here. If you just take a subtract node, plug it in here, and as you can see now, if we take it to 2D, we actually have this really nice uniform thing. And as you can see, in each of those cells, we have the exact coordinate space that we need. So if you plug this into the circle and set it to split, as you can see, each one of those circles is now distributed according to the Voronoi texture, which is really nice because it doesn't cost us any more power. Make the scale as small as we want, as large as we want. It won't affect performance at all. It's just the initial cost for one circle, one texture. That's all. And now we can start to kind of enhance the things. For example, we can take the color node, and what you can do is you can take the separate XYZ node, plug it into the color, and now you have 3 random values for each. And now you could, for example, have a random take a map range, kind of decrease the maximum size. And one thing that we still have, which is kind of a problem, is that we have these edges, which is kind of, you can't really get around of this. It's just a thing, some artifacts you have to live with. And if somebody knows a decent solution for this, honestly, I'd really welcome this. Just make the circles smaller on average. But the thing is that then you kind of have really dense grids, which kind of sucks. Let's actually take the hyperbolic star that we have here now. Kind of have to put in really, really small values here. So it would really make sense to have a divide option here. The visualize that I'm using here can be sometimes a little bit misleading just because the outlines are so thick, and especially with the hyperbolic star, which is kind of inaccurate, can be kind of difficult. But as you can see here, we now have this beautiful Starfield, which is basically completely for free, and you can control a lot of things. I encourage you, of course, to play with these values. So what you can, of course, do, take a math node, set it to multiply. I plugged it into size value, make it real small. And now as you can see, you have like these different sized stars all around. If you want to take it one step further, and as you can see, you can still like decrease the size. And of course, now you have to make the stars smaller. Probably automate this also. But what I also like to do in this case, I'd like to take another noise texture, take the position as the vector, and use map range function, then take another multiply, plug it in here. If we take a look at the actual output now, you're gonna see that for each cell we only have one scale, which is what we want. And now, as you can see, we kind of dial in the scale. Just like this. Also by the way, I used a mapping node to kind of scale up and scale down all of this. And as you can see, the noise texture, what it does here is it gives kind of patterns in the stars, which breaks up the regularity a lot, which is really, really nice. And you get stars which get smaller the further you get away, but every star has like a distinct size. And you still get, unfortunately, it'll get these cutoffs which come from the Voronoi texture. For example, here you see it as well, so they can actually overlap, which is really unfortunate. But I don't know a good way around it yet. Yeah, so you can have a really nice Starfield with this. You can also use this texture for all kinds of other stuff. Use the same noise texture with the same parameters. Instead of plugging it into the position node, you could plug it into here and the actual vector, get a more smooth thing, and use that as a background. And then of course the colors are not really optimal. You would probably use for the space. You'd probably not exactly the best thing, realistic renders, but for cartoon renders, it's probably a really great thing. Both of these things, so the Voronoi distribution and the hyperbolic star, can be used anywhere independently from each other, and you can use circles, rectangles, or whatever, and distribute them around here. This is really the power of the system, is to use this for anything. And kind of as a bonus, I want to show you a more sophisticated example of what you can actually achieve, or what I actually regularly do with this system in order to make my animations. And this is also the reason why I don't use After Effects, why I don't use traditional software to animate, and why I actually prefer Blender over other programs. As you can see, this is my shader graph. I actually also have the hyperbolic star in here. I have various other things. I have, for example, I have a sickle. I have various other nodes, like a positioning node, which is basically just a glorified add node. I have a rounded rectangle, which comes from Inigo Quilez. I put in symmetry nodes. A lot of like convenience functions. Also, like the fill shader is pretty much just what we had before. And yeah, then I have like these things which are completely made by me, except for the primitives. For example, here you have an isosceles triangle, which comes again from Inigo Quilez. Difference, so like when you have two objects, you can have a difference of them, you can have unions, you can have intersections. All these functions, I mean, these are pretty simple, but they also came initially from Inigo Quilez, even though they're pretty widely known. And all of these kinds of things, and you can kind of start build up your library. And if you look into my library, it's kind of grown a lot, all of my shader functions. And let me just show you the output of this, which is right here. This is not, I'm going to show the full animation in full speed, but this is the final animations that I made with this, or maybe not completely final. Still working on it, but this is a work in progress thing of what you can achieve with this. And the great thing is that all of this is still parametric. Start to see when I start playing around with all of these values. See, for example, the sickle which is basically the moon in the background, which is kind of physically inaccurate as these stars shine through. As you can see, you can have the separation controlled here directly. Can have things like this directly controlled, the thickness of this. And it's just a kind of more refreshing way to work with animation, because you don't have these hugely inefficient systems where you just end up copy and pasting stuff over and over, but you spend a lot of time, admittedly, in building up your library, building up this node graph to control everything. But once you have it in place, you just have the values to play with, and you can just focus on refining the animation. I'm going to blend in some further examples of stuff I did with this exclusively. I did some work for the German YouTube channel ClickZoom, and the network of it is in 1054. And I'm going to blend in those two as well. And I did also some work for my streamer friend Asa Kester, which in my opinion turned out pretty well. And it's just the great thing is that once you're set with the node graph, you can just start playing with values and refining, and you have a really fast iteration process. But I guess it's probably not for everyone, as it's very math heavy, and you kind of have to get over this initial bump of this confusing node mess. But once you're in my opinion, it's pretty amazing to work with. So that's it for me for now. If you had fun, hope you learned something, and see you next time.